Welcome back to another, I guess, podcast that we are putting on. My name is Jason Wood, and along with Lee Maddox and Michael Maddox, we are partners in a nationwide brokerage company.
Jason, office leases. It's the most difficult part about the transaction.
Yes.
You probably agree. I've just had a situation where we've been working on a practice. We met with the seller. What I was doing in the meeting with the seller, asked them to give me the lease. I reviewed the lease. I looked at all the terms of the lease when they were there, pointed out the things that I thought were problematic, and notified them in the meeting that I thought we needed to contact immediately the landlord to do an amendment with the lease to try to get things fixed up before we went forward, with trying to selling the practice. So 2 months later, after a back and forth with the landlord, where we thought we had a deal done for a 5-year lease with a 5-year option, landlord came back with a 5-year lease with a 5-year option with a redevelopment clause,
Ouch.
which allows them to terminate us anytime anytime during the option term. So office leases tend to give us a hard time, and being an attorney and a broker, I'm always trying to get ahead of this problem. And I'm sure you see situations all the time where you're working on a transaction and either the broker or the seller has any idea of some of the things that are wrong with their office leases. So short-term office leases, landlords have termination provisions, landlords have provisions where they can take their profit when they sell their practices, landlords have provisions where they can did I say terminate the lease already?
Mm-hmm.
Take their profits, and they can relocate them to another space or to another building. And of course, the deadly redevelopment or termination for redevelopment clause. So what are you advising your clients when they call you up and they say, I'm thinking about selling my practice? Do you just tell them just call a broker, or do you say, let me send you a lease? We should do a quick review on your lease and try to renegotiate favorable terms? Tell me what you're seeing a lot in your private practice as it relates to office leases for people that are getting prepared to sell their practices
Right.
Open market.
So I typically say that the lease is the most forgotten asset that a dentist has. The vast majority of dentists don't have their lease reviewed by an attorney. They believe that they used a broker, and the broker is supposed to provide all the negotiations, both business and legal. The problem is a lot of brokers don't necessarily want attorneys involved in connection with the lease. They just want to get paid. And so I would say still a majority of dentists have never had their lease reviewed by an attorney. And so what we tell all of our clients who are, gearing towards that part of their career of selling is you need to have your lease reviewed well in advance of going to market. And if you have some of these negatives in your lease, we need to deal with it way out in front. If you have a relocation clause, if you have your options being personal, if you have the transfer premium that you suggested, we want to deal with this when you go to exercise your next option so that when you come to market, you've got most, if not all, of these major issues dealt with. And so I would say that for those sellers out there who didn't have their lease reviewed, don't panic, but you need to handle things appropriately. So if you know that your timeline is 5 to 10 years from now, have your lease reviewed, because unfortunately, if you go to market and you've listed with a broker, the problem is that most brokers out there throughout the United States do not have a financial / legal / accounting background. And a lot of them, the vast majority of them, were at one time equipment salesmen. They don't have the knowledge to say, send me over your lease. Oh, crap, you have a lot of these provisions in your lease before we go to market, before you sign a listing agreement that requires you to list with me for a year. Let us take advantage, or let's try to renegotiate these lease issues. So now all of a sudden, you signed a listing agreement with a broker who didn't understand what was in your lease, and now you've gone to market, you're in a contract, and now you find out that you have all these negatives in your lease. And it can really derail somebody's ability to sell their practice. So I would suggest that well in advance, you have an attorney who has extensive knowledge of leases review, or, I mean, like our firm, I mean, we've got multiple attorneys who are brokers, who we review those leases before we go to market. We review them to make sure that there's not any issues. And by the way, if there are issues, we deal with it as a part of our broker services. And so I would say that the more time you give yourself to plan for your eventual sale, the more likely we are to be able to protect them from those major issues.
Yeah, great. And the dental lenders will fund a transaction. Some dental lenders will fund a transaction with 5 years.
Correct.
But a lot of buyers won't buy a practice if there's just 5 years, because they're looking at what the cost would be to move and do a rebuild or new build in another location. And don't quote me on the numbers, but I'm hearing $500,000-$600,000 for a 1,500 square foot operatory,
right?
A square foot building, square foot space. I'm not sure if that's with or without equipment, but it's pretty expensive to build out a space. And so really the options when we get into the situation where a seller has a lease that's not favorable, we only have a few options, right? So like what's the option that how are we going to help the seller who suddenly finds out they have 2 years left on their lease and the landlord's not going to renew it, or 6 months on the lease, the landlord's not going to renew it? I mean, we don't have any choice but to help them try to find another location to move to, or shut the practice down, or to do a chart sale. But it's generally too late. If you get less than 6 months, it's pretty hard to identify a space, negotiate a lease, and do a build out. That takes 6 to 12 months, maybe 18 months, depending on it. So I that's one aspect of office leases that we can reasonably manage, because we can try to anticipate, after looking at least, anticipate the problems and see if we can fix them. The other thing that happens in office leases, and you know this all the time, we're very late in the transaction and we can't get the landlord to respond.
Right.
Because they don't find it important for them to take the time and help us with an office lease. And I think the landlord's perception is the dentist is making all this money, or the healthcare professional is making all the money, and they're making nothing. And what's generally thought out there in the real estate world is businesses are only successful because it's all about location, location, location. So I think it just really irks them that the dentist or healthcare provider is selling their business and getting hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars, and they're getting nothing. So that's why they have those profit-taking provisions there. You want to explain to the audience a little bit more what a profit-taking provision is, or transfer premium?
So what Lee is talking about is what's called a transfer premium. And the transfer premium language, as you know, was actually put in so that when a tenant was subleasing or was trying to make money off of the space that is the landlord's asset, the landlord wanted either a portion of that, or in some cases all of that, which is above what the tenant was paying. So if I'm paying $5,000 a month on rent and I sublease it at $8,000, what that transfer premium language was supposed to do was supposed to say, hey, if you're subleasing this out and you're making a profit, I'm entitled to, a lot of the leases say 50% of whatever you're getting above the rental rate. Some leases say 100%, but that was the original genesis of the transfer premium language. The problem is we've got some amazing unscrupulous landlords throughout the United States, and they have taken this, as landlords do. They sit around, they go to conventions just like dentists. They're probably much more palatial, the Alps and Tahiti and things like that, but. And they sit around smoking cigars in barely lit rooms, devising new ways of being able to, how can we fleece our tenants more? And so the transfer premium language has now morphed into any consideration that a tenant
or
may
other
consideration that a tenant may receive in connection with the premises.
Now, how enforceable is that?
Great question. So in California and some other states, transfer premium language associated with the sale of a business is not allowed. Now, understand that that is the first line. Like, you can't do it. But there are ways in which landlords can back end into still fleecing you for money. But in other states, Texas, some of the big population states where a lot of people are moving to, there's no such provision. And so a transfer premium could be 50% of the purchase price the sale price of your practice. So to give you an example of like a real life situation, I'm selling my practice for $1 million. And the rest of my lease payments equal $200,000. And so I've got $1 million sales price. I have $200,000 in rental payments that I will owe for the remainder of the lease. The transfer premium language says that the landlord is entitled to 50% of any excess consideration above what the landlord would be entitled to under the rent. So what does that mean? That means that we have a delta of $800,000 between $1 million and $200,000, which is what the rental payments are. That transfer premium language means that you may have to pay the landlord $400,000 of your purchase price simply because you missed this language in your lease in states that don't protect against it. And so, again, going back to your point, we have to get those leases as soon as we can before we go to market so we can plan for these things. And the more time we have to plan, the more likely we're going to be able to help you.
Right. So that's right. And the laws are not as crystal clear as we think. Mm-hmm. And the landlord sometimes, notwithstanding what the law says on its face, can, by putting the tenant on notice, maybe make the law work in their favor. Let's just say that based on some case law. Some other issues, options. So an option to lease is an irrevocable offer, irrevocable right for the tenant to extend their lease for a period of time as long as they give the landlord notice, pursuant to the terms that are set forth in the lease. So typically no earlier than 12 months, no sooner than 6 months. What have you seen in your experience when our clients have either failed to provide the option notice, or if the lease says the option is personal and not transferable? What have you experienced in the bad things that have happened categories?
Yeah.
Where our clients are now trying to transfer their lease, do an assignment, transfer the lease, and they're trying now to get the landlord to give more time, either through an extension or through an option. Like, how are you trying to solve those problems for our clients?
So about 99% of leases will have the options being personal. And so it's extremely important, again, that you have to have your lease reviewed. There's very few leases that will say, even leases that are quote unquote standard or are form documents will say that the options are personal. And so what does that mean? That means that the options are personal to me, the tenant. I cannot transfer them to a potential buyer. Why is that important? Well, as you said earlier, a bank needs at least 5 years of a lease in order to lend money. Well, some banks want 10 years. Now, do they need a 10-year lease? No, what they need is a 10-year of total term. And so what does that mean? I have 3 years left on my lease, but I have 2 5-year options. As long as those options are assignable to the buyer, you're covered. You're fine. You're wonderful. Loan approved. Here's your money. But if your options are personal, the bank looks at that and they say, you only have 3 years left. You need to get those options assignable, which requires you to go to the landlord and say, dear, sweet, wonderful landlord, can you please allow me to assign these options over to my buyer? Now, some landlords will do it. Some landlords understand long-term relationships and the fact that, they've got a dentist in there, second generation, third generation dentist in there, who will continue to make payments, very low default rates, in relation to restaurants and other industries. But then there are a lot of landlords, Westwood Financial, Irvine Company, some of these big players, they know exactly what their leases say, and you're going to pay. You're going to pay a lot sometimes to get those options to be assignable. I mean, I've seen $50,000, $100,000. The highest ever was $350,000.
Wow.
But understand, it was a unique set of circumstances, and it still made sense for the seller to sell. But that's maybe a war story for a different day. But these are serious issues, and it's 8-point font that you can barely read in the lease, and if you don't deal with it correctly, it can cost you a lot of money.
Yeah, I think almost all of my clients, when I speak to them, will say, I have a great lease.
Yeah.
I had a really good broker. He did a great job. Used him multiple times. I got a great lease. And I have a 5-year lease and I have a 5-year option. And to your point, when I look at it, the option's not transferable. And that's when the problems start. Because then we go to the landlord and we say, hey, we need, to make this transaction work, we need to get some more time, either through an extension or through an option. And many landlords today will say, we don't give options.
Oh, gosh, yeah.
Some of the landlords will say, we're not interested in extending the term because we don't need to. And then some landlords come back and say, we might have other plans for the building. And that's the worst for us. Mm-hmm. So if the landlord says we have other plans for the building, they're going to remodel, redevelop, relocate, we can't sell the practice.
And you're lucky if they actually tell you that.
Right.
So, because they're not required to.
Yeah. So that is a big problem. And I think that I think having your lease reviewed by a good, it seems to be kind of industry specific. I think a good dental or good healthcare attorney will catch these issues.
Right.
There can be really good lease negotiators that negotiate things where it's not as important because the leasehold improvements don't cost so much and they can easily be moved. I can move the desk in my office here very quickly, but it's super difficult and very expensive to move a dental office. You lose the goodwill and it costs you a lot of money. There's some other provisions in the lease that are sneaky.
Well, before we move on, what about the option language as it relates to rental rates?
Well, that's what I was just going to say. So, exactly, good. We're thinking the same. Mm-hmm. So, the other issue is the landlord can say, first off, let's talk. An option means that the landlord is allowing us to increase the time that we stay in the premises on the same exact terms in the lease, except for the rental rate goes up to fair market value or appraised value or by some preset dollar amount. But landlords can condition that and say, we will approve the option or we will approve the assignment, either one, if the rental rate can go up. So you're talking about if we have an option to renew, how does the rental rate goes up? A lot of the option leases say the rent's going to go to fair market value or fair rental value, or they might go to fair market rental value, no less than 3%, no more than 5%. There might be a high and a low range on that. But the other issue I was going to get to, and we'll come back to yours, I guess, is on assignments, Mike. We have a practice right now where we have a landlord that's all business, and they have a term in there that allows them to raise the rent. And we're in a shared space situation, right? Mm-hmm. And so we got an inquiry from the bank today because we now have to do a purchase price reduction because the increased rental rate that was presented to us is going to cost, did I tell you, it's like $93,000 over the next 5 or 7 years. And they won't give us an option. And they have profit-taking language. And they have the right to terminate the lease. And we're in a shared space situation. So check the box on all the things that are impossible to deal with. But the seller's reasonable and the seller's willing to pay the price, but we never know if the buyer is going to stay in or the remaining partner is going to stay in. So you're working on that today, correct?
Yep. We got to let escrow know and figure out what the new purchase price is going to be.
But you notified, and I think this is what's probably different about our brokerage firms. This was a front end issue.
Oh,
you guys, you were dealing with this even before they became clients, right? Like,
right.
Hey, these are the issues. Here's the plan, so that you actually put a plan in place.
Yeah, this is why you don't use a real estate agent who's not a dental broker to sell your business, because they don't understand the intricacies of it. But in the first meeting, we said, look, we know you're a landlord. This is going to be rough. Let me see your lease. And I went right to that section in lease and said, okay, we got a problem. We don't know what your rental rate's going to be, but the rental rate always goes up. Right. And so if the rental rate goes up, then the question is, will the buyer absorb that rate? And the answer typically is no, right? Because Mike knows when we do the practice valuations, there's a rental amount on the tax return in the P&Ls, and that impacts what our net income is. And if that rental rate is going to go up by some magnitude, then all of a sudden our net income is going to go down by the same adjustment level. So I think that we're always looking for that, right? In our evaluations, trying to figure out, what's going to be a positive and negative going forward. And certainly the rental rates, and I think we talk about another podcast, if they own the building,
right,
and they're overcharging or undercharging, we can talk about that. So the rental rate thing is definitely an issue. What are any other issues that you're finding coming up?
We've got a relocation clause. We've got, staying liable for the entirety of the lease plus unexercised options. Those are some big ones. And so, how do we deal with that?
Yeah, let's talk about that remaining liability thing, because I think people think that the profit-taking provisions, the premium is grossly unfair.
Right.
And they are shocked when they hear it. But they're equally offended when they find out that they're selling their business and they may have to keep paying the rent if the person they took over their space doesn't pay the rent.
So, yes, but I'm a little heavy-handed with some clients. When they have unrealistic expectations of, well, this shouldn't be in my lease. Well, buddy, this is what you signed 15 years ago without anybody helping you. And so what I tell my clients is, it's not reasonable to expect your landlord to immediately release you from liability. It's just not. Can we get it? Maybe in a blue moon.
Yeah,
we can get it. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to do a balancing act here. We're trying to give the landlord something that they want, protection, for a period of time in which eventually the argument that the landlord has about keeping you liable goes away. And so we're pretty successful at getting your liability released after the existing term. So let's say you have 2 years left on your term, but you have 2 5-year options that have not been exercised. We are insanely successful at basically saying that you will remain liable for those 2 years, and then when the option is exercised, you get released. And we're pretty good at that. And we have arguments, and then if we get rejected, we have a secondary argument, and if that gets rejected, we have a third argument that we have. So there's this falling back position, which I don't think a lot of people do, but it's extremely important. Now, even though the default rate for dentists is very low, it's one of the worst things that can happen for you as a seller is, you're out there drinking Mai Tais in Kauai 7 years after you've sold your dental practice, and you get a call from the landlord. You're like, what? This person hasn't called me in 7 years. You pick it up and they say, hey, we regret to inform you, your buyer is defaulted under the lease. You owe us $25,000, and it's accumulating the next rental payment is due, March 1st. So there's definitely a lot of things that you need to be aware of when you go to sell, which is why, again, you need to have it reviewed. It's not like the end of the world, gnashing of teeth and pulling out your hair if you have these provisions in, but you have to give yourself time. And if you give yourself time, there's plans. And then there's a plan B and a plan C and a plan D if you're talking with the right people.
Yeah, I think in the last 25 years, I've only had one client that got that call.
Yeah.
And he was crying on the phone. He had been retired, and it happened during COVID. And the landlord called up and said, and he sold his practice for like $1.5 million. It was a great practice that went to zero during COVID. The buyer just bailed. Well, it didn't go to zero. It went to zero after the buyer bailed. And the grown man, retired man, was crying on the phone saying, I don't have the money to pay this bill. And I think in that situation, it was negotiated that he would stay on to the end of the term. Now, what's interesting about staying on the end of the term, it could be 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, right? Depends on how long the term is. And landlords, sometimes you try to get the landlord to release after 1 year, 2 years. They don't do it. Then you try to go to end of term. But in this particular case, it was like 4 or 5 years. It was probably a $200,000 liability. And he just wasn't ready to pay for that. Now, what our listeners should know is that if there is a bank lender, and we didn't talk about carrying notes. That's another thing. And some of the downfalls of carrying a note is for the buyer,
right?
A promissory note. But if there's a lender involved, the lender wants to recoup some of that money. So they have a lien on the assets, and then they're going to try to come in and find somebody to take that space. And also the landlord has a duty to mitigate it as well, right? So there are two things that can potentially help. One is like a B of A or a Provide or a U.S. Bank. They're going to come in, they're going to call up a broker, they're going to try to find somebody to come in and buy that and salvage it. And even if they get pennies on the dollar, they'll do it. And then the second thing is the lender, the landlord has to make some effort to try to release the space. So even if you stay liable after it, the risk is very low that it's going to happen, that the buyer is not going to be successful because the default rate is so low. And then secondly, there's some things that can help us with the lenders coming in and wanting to sell the place and get it relet. And then also the landlords having a responsibility to do that. So I think that this is a painful issue for our clients. And like you said, if they didn't read the lease, if they didn't have an attorney look at it, it's the first time they're hearing it. And like you, I'll tell my clients, we can try to solve this in the beginning. Less than 5% of the time can I fix it in the beginning.
Right.
And even if I think I have it fixed in the beginning, when we get to the time of the assignment, the landlord says they have the right they have to be reasonable in deciding if they're, they can't unreasonably withhold consent. Now, some leases will say they can, but most leases will say they can't unreasonably withhold the consent. But what they'll do is if you have a release of liability, they'll just say the buyer's not qualified. But if you want to do the deal, you got to be back on the hook.
Right.
So it's a difficult issue. So we talked about remaining liable. We talked about transfer premium. We didn't talk about termination options yet. So you want to go on that one?
Let's talk about the most nefarious section in a lease, and that's the recapture clause. So for our listeners, what's the recapture clause?
You want me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So the landlord reserves the right that on the mere request to do a transfer, which could be for an assignment or a sublease, and they're different. An assignment means you give away all your rights and interests and somebody else takes your space in the premises. And consent means you give away some of your rights and you retain the rights at the end. So you can rent it for a day, a week, a month.
That's a subletting.
Yeah, the sublease. Yeah. I'm sorry. That's what I meant to say.
Yeah.
So sublease, you retain some of your rights. And so the mere request of asking for an assignment or a sublease triggers the landlord to say, yes, I consent. No, I don't consent. Or, you know what, I don't consent and I want to take your space back. And they terminate your lease and they take all or part of your space back. And they call that a termination recapture provision.
Or threaten to.
Or threaten, yes.
Yeah. And why would a landlord want to do that? Why would a landlord want to terminate a extremely low defaulting tenant's lease?
Yeah, they have a bigger fish. They have another tenant that wants the space that's going to pay more rent, or they just want more rent. They want to go to a different use. And we do see that. We do see some buildings that have medical dental that change. We have people that want to terminate the lease because they want to tear the building down. So there could be lots of reasons. I don't know what you're thinking, but those are some of the reasons.
So I've had it where they just want to fleece the seller.
Well, that could be.
Because, well, you asked me to assign, I'm going to recapture, but I may reconsider if you pay me $100,000.
Yeah.
And what you need to understand is there is something. I mean, if I demand it, that's extortion, that's a felony. But if I'm requesting, if I'm making arguments, that would be legal extortion. I mean, it's a different term, but a landlord has the ability to do that if they toe the line on legality, to say, look, you're the one changing the parameters of our deal. And as a result, I don't feel comfortable. I'm going to terminate your lease. I can probably rebalance this if you give me $75,000 so that my liability, my risk has been properly taken care of. And we've seen it. I would love to just spend an hour listing all of the bad landlords that you should stay away from. Mm-hmm. The problem is they probably occupy 60 to 70% of the real estate. And so, again, it's not the end. If that is in your lease, there is a certain way that you ask for the assignment. Hypothetically speaking, if I was to, would you be invoking this provision? And then get it in writing. But there's ways, and that's what I don't understand about this industry sometimes, is people think that it is the same. This is how I do practice A, this is how I do practice B, and it's always the same. And there's just such a disservice to the client because every practice is different. Every situation is different.
Well, what would you do? Let's say somebody comes to you and they got 1 year left in their lease. They have an option for 5 years. That's personal, can't be transferred. They have termination rights in the lease. They have recapture rights in the lease. The option language says it has to be on the same terms. Are you going to recommend, if that person wants to sell in the near future, or I guess any reason, are you going to recommend that they not exercise their option and try to renegotiate the lease? Or are you going to recommend that they go for the option and try to get the changes in an amendment? And I heard you say it just right now. That's why I made me think about it. If you say, what are you going to do? Well, I'm not exercising my option. I'm just asking questions. How are you? Clearly the real estate brokers don't want us to exercise our options, right?
No, because they want
to go back and renegotiate the terms, get another commission. But it can be strategic, right? Mm-hmm. In some situations. So are you gonna go for the amendment 9 out of 10 times? Or are you gonna go for the new lease?
I'm gonna do whatever I feel the landlord will allow me to do. So if I feel that they don't want to pay a commission and that they would rather negotiate with me all day long, but I'm saying, look, and again, it depends on the landlord. I'm trying to set this up for you, landlord, so that you have another 15 or 20 years of rent roll, if this is what you want.
Right. For free, no broker.
Exactly.
Yeah.
My client is getting older, and we are trying to position this practice to sell. When we sell, that new dentist is going to need a very long-term lease. So I'm giving this to you for free. However, I need a few things modified. Very successful. Yeah. But it depends on who the landlord it is. Depends on what you chose to do 15 or 20 years ago.
Right.
If you're in a redevelopment area, it's going to be kind of hard. And so what do I do? Okay, we've got a year left. If the landlord is telling me all the things that are red flags, then my response is we need to find an underperforming practice within a 1 mile radius, buy that sucker really quick, relocate it, and you can possibly get an underperforming practice for way less than what it costs to do a build out. You've now secured your practice. I'm assuming it's a practice doing $800, $1 million, so it makes economic sense to do that. You now have inherited new patients, so you've jumped up your potential purchase price when you actually go to sell. So we can maybe even make it a net neutral for you having to relocate. And then now all of a sudden you've got a great lease, you've got this, you've got that, and now you can turn around and sell it. As opposed to what you said before, which is if you're screwed, you're selling patient charts, and patient charts, you're lucky to get 20, 30%. So,
Right. So the most expensive leases out there with the biggest risk are triple net leases.
correct.
And the most risk with the triple net lease is a single tenant building, right?
Mm-hmm.
And when you have a client who's buying a dental practice with a single tenant triple net lease, what are you concerned about for that tenant, that buyer potential tenant?
Well, first I'm trying to buy the building, especially if it's the seller. If I'm representing the buyer, I'm gonna make it an extreme hard push to buy the building concurrently when I buy the practice. If I can't get that, then I'm gonna ask for an option to acquire in the future. If I can't get that, I'll settle on a right of first refusal, but I hate those because they're worthless. But so, that's if the seller is the owner. If it's a third party, and I don't know why, but I've come across, and I don't know if you guys have come across this, but I've come across more and more sellers who are selling their building
Before their practice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is the dumbest thing.
Yeah.
And yet, I don't know who, this is literally in the last 2 or 3 years where it's become almost an epidemic. And I'm like, who is convincing these people to do this?
Yeah,
It's costing them
good
so
point.
much money.
We're seeing that too, and then they're signing leases that are terrible,
Right.
And then they sell the building and sign a terrible lease, and then when they go to sell, they have no flexibility to do anything.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a nightmare.
So I would say that what I'm trying to do in a triple net lease, single tenant, I'm trying to protect from the big ticket items is the quickest way of explaining it. I'm trying to protect from, a single payment for a roof, single payment for capital, expenditures. I try to get those excluded. I can't usually get those excluded. If I can't get them excluded, then I want them over the useful life. So I'm elongating my payments.
Right.
Um,
So you're recommending that they'd get a full inspection of the building as if they were going to buy the building,
Yes.
correct? Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because then hey, look, the HVAC has passed its useful life. The roof, it's 25 years, and it's a 30-year roof. So planning all of that is extremely important. The other issue, and it varies by jurisdiction, but property taxes. If the building is sold and I'm triple net and I don't have a protection in there regarding property taxes, my property tax may be $6,000 a year now, but if it sells, it might jump up to 20. And I'm responsible for that unless I put a provision in that says that I'm not paying in connection with a future sale. It can only go up a certain amount. You can't really get that a lot. Sometimes you can.
Hardly ever.
No, I know.
I'll never give it to you. Don't
yeah.
ask. You're not getting it.
Never?
Never.
What if I ask nicely?
No.
So there are some people that will do it, but I agree. The vast majority of the time, I'm not going to be able to get it. But sometimes I can get some exclusions on that.
Yeah. So this turns out to be a hidden issue. That's why we're raising it. If you're a seller and you have a single tenant building, there's a lot of people that are going to want that. If they buy it, then they absorb all of the responsibilities that Jason's talking about: roof, repair, sewage, air conditioning. They absorb that, and they seem to be okay with it because it's their building, and they think they're going to get equity in the building, and it's going to be part of their estate plan to have that building. But if they're the tenant and they come in to buy your practice, and let's say they buy the practice for $500,000, and let's say your rent's $1.25, it doesn't have to be that much. But then if you, the landlord, turn around and say, I'm going to paint the building, or I'm going to change the roof, or I want to repave the parking lot, or I want to change the landscaping, all of those costs, 100% go back to the tenant because they're the only tenant. So I think in those situations, the liability on the single tenant lease exceeds the purchase price of the practice sometimes.
Sometimes.
And so it'll blow a deal if the seller wants to take a hard and fast position on that. And so your position is, yeah, let's amortize that. Let's take the capital improvements, those big ticket expenses, and amortize those over their useful lives. So if we have a, and we'll just use an example, $120,000 ticket item over 10 years, $12,000 would go a year or whatever. So, or $100,000, $10,000 a year. But yeah, I just wanted to raise that issue for you sellers that have single tenant buildings. If they're in disrepair, it's going to be a problem when you go to sell the practice. If you have them in great shape, that's great. That's going to make it easier. But I will also say I don't think it's very fun being a landlord for a dentist with flooding issues. But in a single tenant building, it's not as bad as multi-tenant buildings. But for the sellers, we have to be careful and make sure we set ourselves up for success. For the buyers, be aware that you need to do a complete building inspection as if you were buying the building, and because the buyers don't want to pay for roofs and those big time capital expenses when they don't own the building. And just to be clear, if you're a tenant in a single tenant triple net lease, you're paying all the expenses in that building almost as if you're the owner. You're paying the insurance, the taxes, all the maintenance, all the repairs, structural, non-structural, everything. And because like I said, they're the most dangerous lease out there.
So for sellers, understand that unfortunately, like most things with dental practice transitions and selling, it's more complicated than first meets the eye. So make sure that you get your lease reviewed early. Make sure that it's before market, because one of the worst things that you could do is sign a listing agreement with a broker that doesn't know these issues. You then go to market and you then enter into an LOI. And now all of a sudden, all of these lease issues are coming to the forefront and you get upset, you pull back, and then you get hit with all of the potential buyers that you can, if you choose not to use that broker anymore, all the potential buyers that you can't sell the practice to now in the future if you ever go back to market after fixing your lease. So it's extremely important. Get it reviewed before you go to market by someone who actually knows leases.